I was sitting on my porch sipping sweet tea from a glass older than most of my neighbors when a dust cloud rolled in from the gravel road like a tumbleweed with bad intentions. At first, I thought it was just the wind being dramatic, but then came the hard hats, 5 of them, trudging across my family farmland like they owned it. One of them, a lanky kid with a clipboard and a nervous twitch, walked right up to the middle of my field and hammered a wooden stake into the earth like his name was on the deed. Attached to that stake was a bright orange sign that read, "Future site of Willow Creek Estates Phase 2. I choked on my tea, not the dramatic kind, the real kind, the kind where your eyes water and you contemplate whether this is how it ends, taken out by mint leaves and HOA arrogance. I walked over in my usual manner, slow, deliberate, the way an old dog approaches a rattlesnake. The kid looked up, startled. He asked if I was one of the locals. I told him I was the local, as in the man whose grandfather bought this land when Theodore Roosevelt was still alive. He blinked like I'd spoken in Morse code and gestured vaguely at the sign. This parcel was cleared for development by the HOA, sir. We've got permits. Permits? I asked him to show me a name, any name on those papers that matched mine. He fumbled through a folder, and there it was in big bold letters. HOA Property Transfer / Mercer. My name, my land, but under someone else's authority. I hadn't sold anything, hadn't missed a tax bill, hadn't even rented out a single square foot. Yet somehow, the entire southern half of my farmland, 1,700 acres of fertile, sun-kissed soil, was now supposedly in the hands of a housing developer named Aspire Vista Holdings. It felt like getting punched in the soul. That land had been in my family for 4 generations. My father plowed it with mules. I laid irrigation lines with my bare hands before most of these HOA folks were out of diapers. And now some spreadsheet cowboys in button-ups were about to turn it into luxury condos with a rustic feel. I called the county office right then and there, speakerphone blazing while the clipboard crew stood awkwardly in the dust. The woman on the line confirmed the nightmare. Yes, there was a deed transfer. Yes, it was filed legally. No, they had no record of protest from me. That's when I got suspicious. I hadn't received a single notice. No calls, no mail, no certified letters, nothing. The next stop was the HOA office, or as I call it, the Petty Palace of Doom. I walked in, boots still dusty from my own stolen land, and found her, Karenetta Brimley, president of the Oakwood Trails Homeowners Association. She was perched behind her desk like a hawk with a handbag, sipping a caramel monstrosity from a cup bigger than her head. She didn't look surprised to see me. In fact, she looked pleased, like a cat that finally cornered the mouse. "Mr. Mercer," she chirped, "we've been expecting you." That's never a good sign. I told her there had to be some mistake. She gave me that slow blink people use right before saying something deeply idiotic. Then she pulled out a stack of files and said, "According to our records, your land was under lien due to unpaid HOA fines dating back to 2009. I laughed, not the polite kind either, the full-body gasp of a man who's just been told his house was repossessed because he sneezed wrong in 2010. She explained, like she was talking to a particularly dim child, that over the years I had accrued more than $11,000 in fines. For what? I asked. "Non-compliance," she said. "Unapproved fencing, uncut hedges, a rooster complaint, and notably, a plastic pink flamingo left in your yard for 37 consecutive days." I stared at her, wondering if this was performance art. It wasn't. Apparently, they'd sent me notices, dozens. I asked to see the records. Most had been mailed to an address I hadn't used in 15 years. Convenient. And because I hadn't responded, the HOA escalated the lien to a claim of abandonment, then executed a sale to recoup the fees. I asked her if she thought it was reasonable to sell 1,700 acres of prime farmland to cover a flamingo violation. Her reply? "The bylaws are very clear." That's when I knew I was dealing with a full-blown clipboard tyrant with a god complex and a Pinterest board full of vengeance. I went home pounding with the kind of rage that only retirees and country songwriters truly understand. I needed answers. More importantly, I needed leverage. That's when I opened the old filing cabinet in my shed, the one with the faded sticker that says Mercer Water Rights, Private. Most folks in town don't know this, but before I retired, I was the regional hydrologist for the state. I designed and built the aquifer system that supports this entire valley. When the county refused to modernize, I took matters into my own hands and legally acquired the water rights underneath my farmland. And not just my land, The entire aquifer, including the parts that service Oakwood trails. That's right. Every drop that runs through their sprinklers, dishwashers, and jacuzzis flows through a network I laid down, funded, and ultimately took ownership of. They sold my land, but they didn't know I control their entire water supply. As the realization settled in, a slow, crooked grin spread across my face. You don't mess with an old man who's buried more pipe than secrets. Karenetta and her army of pettiness had just declared war on the wrong grandpa. And while they were out there planning gated communities and rustic-themed cul-de-sacs, I was about to show them just how dry HOA politics can get when you cross the one man who still holds the valve. This wasn't just about land anymore. This was about legacy, honor, and a whole lot of revenge served room temperature and bone dry. The sun rose hot and unbothered the next morning, as if it didn't just witness one of the most absurd betrayals in rural history. I stood at the edge of my porch watching a squirrel scratch itself on a tree stump while sipping the last of my bitter coffee. When the sound of 1,000 sprinklers kicked on across the HOA's manicured lawns, that was the moment the idea fully bloomed in my mind. I wasn't going to yell, stump, or call a lawyer first thing like they'd expect. No, I was going to tighten the screws in the only language they understood. Convenience, specifically wet, green convenience. Because if there was one thing HOA folks valued more than their bylaws, it was their perfect, thirsty landscaping. Later that day, the entire community was preparing for the annual summer garden competition, the sacred pilgrimage where HOA members parade their roses and begonia beds like they are auditioning for botanical gladiators. Karenetta, of course, had spent the last month bragging about her hydrangeas, imported soil, a $600 fertilizer subscription, and supposedly a floral pattern so precise it could be seen from Google Earth. She stood in her driveway wearing a sun hat the size of a dinner table, barking orders at a group of landscapers while pointing with a rose-colored clipboard. It was all too perfect. And by perfect, I mean it was begging to be made imperfect. I strolled down to the edge of Zone B, the section of the aquifer system that directly supplied her street and the surrounding for cul-de-sacs. With a pair of gloves and a crescent wrench, I knelt by the access panel. The beauty of being the man who built the system is you know where the pressure points are, the literal and metaphorical ones. One twist, maybe two, and the valves that powered her entire green wonderland would suddenly develop what I like to call selective drought syndrome. By mid-afternoon, her award-winning garden would be looking more like dried confetti. As expected, the first complaints started rolling in around 3 p.m. Mrs. Donnelly next door came out fanning herself and muttering something about her begonias collapsing. Across the street, two dads were arguing about whose sprinkler timer was faulty while their kids tried to splash in a patch of dirt that used to be a lawn. But the main event was Karenetta. When her prized hydrangeas began drooping like sad balloons, she marched outside with a face so red I thought she'd been stung by a wasp made of fury and entitlement. She glared at her hose, gave it a shake, and then stomped toward the HOA office like she was about to sue the sky. I was back on my porch, of course, pretending to read the paper while actually savoring every second of her descent into drought madness. That's when the local news van showed up. Apparently, someone tipped them off about a community water sabotage. And by someone, I mean me, using a burner phone and an extremely convincing imitation of Karenetta's voice. The young reporter, a fresh-faced 20-something with perfect hair and no idea what he'd walked into, knocked on my gate and asked if I knew anything. I gave him my most grandfatherly smile and invited him in for lemonade. We sat in the shade as I told him the entire story. I explained how the HOA illegally sold my land, how I had built and owned the water system they now relied on, and how, unfortunately, equipment failures happen. He ate it up. When the cameraman asked if I had anything else to say on record, I leaned forward and said, I just want my land back. But if Karenetta wants a desert, I'll give her one. That line hit social media like lightning on a dry pine. Within an hour, the clip had been shared thousands of times. Memes popped up left and right. My personal favorite was a picture of Karenetta holding a wilted plant with the caption, HOA meets H2O. Another one had my face on a gallon jug with the title, Tactical Tea Time with Mercer. Of course, virality has consequences. By sundown, Karenetta was in full panic mode. She was pacing around the neighborhood with a Bluetooth earpiece and a stack of papers, demanding everyone remain calm while issuing vague threats about litigation and restorative water incentives. I almost felt bad. Almost. The next day, I noticed something strange. A set of hoses, long and snaking like jungle vines, had been poorly hidden along the hedges of the common green space. Following them, I discovered they led to a gas-powered pump positioned near the community pond. Carinetta and her cronies had set up an illegal siphon to try and bypass the aquifer system. They were literally trying to suck water directly from the emergency fire pond and feed it into the lawns like it was some kind of Mad Max landscaping operation. I burst out laughing. It was the most desperate, most gloriously HOA move I'd ever seen. I let them have their fun for about 24 hours, enough time for word to spread, for the residents to start asking questions. Then I casually walked over during one of their secret hose meetings and cleared my throat. Everyone froze. I leaned in close to the pump, examined it like I was inspecting a prize turkey, then said, "You're tapping my system with garden hoses? That's adorable." They scrambled to defend it, mumbling something about temporary solutions and community-level decisions. I held up a laminated copy of the deed to the aquifer. "This is my property," I said. "You're trespassing and tampering, which, in case no one here has brushed up on municipal code, is a Class C misdemeanor. But don't worry, I'm not pressing charges. Yet." The color drained from Carinetta's face like a watercolor in the rain. She sputtered about talking to her lawyers, to which I replied, "Please do. Maybe they can help you grow better tomatoes while you're at it." I turned on my heel and walked back toward my porch while the group behind me fell into a stunned silence. By nightfall, every sprinkler system in the HOA was bone dry. I turned off the remaining zones for maintenance. Maintenance being me polishing the wrench I used to shut them off. The whispers started spreading faster than fire in dry brush. People were gathering in groups on sidewalks, comparing brown patches and trading rumors. Carinetta was losing control of the narrative, and she knew it. But instead of retreating with grace, she doubled down. She called an emergency HOA meeting the next morning, trying to rally the community against me. She stood at the front of the rec center like a dictator clinging to the last strands of power, explaining that I was endangering the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood. I sat quietly in the back, waiting. When she accused me of intentionally disrupting community function, I raised my hand. "Point of clarification," I said. "Are you referring to when you illegally sold my land, or when you installed an unauthorized pump system on someone else's property?" The room went silent. A few gasps. One guy even chuckled. I pulled out a USB stick and handed it to the board member next to me. "Drone footage," I said, "of the siphon system, with timestamps. Should be fun to watch." The projector clicked on, and there it was, Carinetta in full view, hooking up the hoses herself. The room erupted. People started shouting, not at me, but at her. The tide had turned. I just sat back, arms crossed, and let the chaos unfold. It was only the beginning. By the time the third night of water shutoffs hit, Oakwood Trails had gone from peaceful suburbia to something straight out of a post-apocalyptic sitcom. Lawns that once looked like magazine covers were now dust-blotched patches with crunchy grass. The HOA message board was in full meltdown, each thread more desperate than the last. "My koi pond is gone. Who do we report water theft to? Is it legal to shower at the gym 3 times a day?" But the real masterpiece was a post titled Operation Hydrangea Rescue, written by Carinetta herself. She claimed to be in talks with county officials to restore civility and encouraged residents to keep watering with buckets in the meantime. She even included a photo of herself holding a watering can, surrounded by dead plants. The irony was so thick you could spread it on toast. But while the residents were busy chasing rumors and dribbling bottled water onto their front lawns, I was digging deeper. I had a gut feeling this wasn't just about me or some rogue finds from 2009. No, this smelled like something more rotten, something that went beyond Carinetta's usual brand of neighborhood dictatorship. So I did what any retired man with too much time, a grudge, and a background in hydrology would do. I started poking around. I began with the HOA's public files. At first, everything looked boringly legal. Monthly budgets, landscaping invoices, that kind of fluff. But tucked in a PDF labeled Strategic Development Plan, I saw something odd. A land sale, my land, sold for pennies on the dollar to an entity called Metalux Development LLC. That name rang no bells, and I'd been around long enough to know when something's been made up to sound fancy. A quick online search told me Metalux had been incorporated only 4 months ago, with a single listed executive. When I clicked the name, I almost dropped my mug. Bryce Brimley, Carinetta's brother. I didn't have solid proof yet, but I was standing in the middle of the trail, and the breadcrumbs were all pointing one way. This wasn't about hydrangeas or flamingos or fencing violations. This was about money, big money. Someone had used the HOA to quietly transfer my land to a shell company, probably with the plan of flipping it for millions to developers once the heat cooled down. They thought I wouldn't notice, that I'd be too old or too tired to fight back. And that's where they messed up because I was just getting warmed up. The next step was risky but necessary. I needed real evidence, something undeniable. So I called my old friend Carl, a retired computer forensics guy I served with back in the day. Carl still owed me for that time I bailed him out of a wedding DJ scam in Vegas, so he agreed to help with a little digital fishing. That night, we snuck into the HOA office. Carl brought what he called a polite USB, a little stick that could scan and copy every file on the system in under 10 minutes. I kept watch by the front door while he worked his magic. The place was eerily quiet except for the hum of the AC and the distant sound of sprinklers trying to run with no water. It felt poetic. The next morning, Carl called me, sounding like a kid who found a treasure chest. He'd recovered a trove of emails, contracts, and meeting notes that had never been made public. And there it was, plain as daylight. Karenetta had orchestrated the sale of my land herself. The HOA board never voted. There was no lien, no proper authorization. She'd forged an internal memo using an old letterhead template from 15 years ago, the same one I had designed when I was on the first HOA board back in the 90s. That detail hit like a punch to the gut. She used something I created for transparency and twisted it into a tool for theft. But the best part? The paper trail led directly to a bank transfer, $9,500 from Metalux Development to a private account under the name K. Brimley. It wasn't a smoking gun. It was a blazing cannon aimed at the heart of her little empire. I didn't go public right away. I wanted the impact to land, so I made copies, dozens, digital and physical. I mailed one to the county DA, another to a local news station, and a third to the state office for homeowner association fraud. Then I printed one final copy, placed it in a manila folder, and walked it over to the HOA emergency meeting scheduled for that evening. The rec center was packed. Everyone had shown up, residents, board members, even a couple of developers in suits trying not to sweat through their jackets. Karenetta stood at the front, her smile more forced than usual. She welcomed everyone with fake cheer and started another round of excuses. Unfortunate miscommunications, she called them. Administrative mishaps. I let her talk, let her hang herself with every smug word. Then I stood up, folder in hand, and walked to the front of the room. Since you all love transparency, I said, placing the folder on the table, here's a breakdown of the illegal land sale, the fake lien, and the private bank account tied to Karenetta's name. The silence was nuclear. Not a single cough, not a whisper, just the rustle of papers as the board opened the folder and began reading. A couple of the members visibly paled. One even took out his phone and started filming. Karenetta tried to interrupt, saying I was spreading misinformation, but before she could finish, I pulled out the projector remote and clicked to the next slide. An email chain between her and her brother discussing how to bury the Mercer sale under non-compliance violations. The room exploded. People stood up, shouting. One woman started crying, saying she'd trusted Karenetta for years. A man in a visor yelled, "You sold us out," and another demanded a refund on his HOA dues. That night was chaos, the kind that only happens when people realize they've been played like fools. But in the middle of the storm, I stayed calm. I'd done my part. I'd told the truth. Now the rest was up to them. And as I stepped outside into the dry night air, I heard the sound of someone unlocking a garden hose and then cursing when nothing came out. It reminded me that justice, much like water, flows best when it's earned. And I had just turned the valve. By the next morning, Oakwood Trails was a battlefield of burned trust and brittle lawns. The rec center meeting had gone viral overnight. Someone uploaded the footage of Karenetta's email leak with a slow zoom on her frozen expression and the caption, "When the HOA queen loses her crown." It spread like wildfire. Local news stations showed up with drones to capture the dried-up gardens of suburban scandal, and I had to laugh when a reporter called it the most exciting thing to happen in our county since the great pickleball riot of 2006. But behind all the humor and chaos, something deeper was starting to shift. The community was no longer looking at me like the cranky old man who refused to mow diagonally or who told kids to stop skateboarding near the storm drain. Now they were seeing me for what I had been all along, one of the few people who actually gave a damn about the truth. I spent that morning organizing everything. All the emails, contracts, the bank transfers, even the footage of the illegal siphon system. I had already turned it over to the county prosecutor, but I knew it would take time for legal action to move. In the meantime, the HOA still technically existed, and Karenetta, though stripped of her moral authority, hadn't officially been removed. That meant we were in a sort of bureaucratic no-man's land. The remaining board members were scrambling, trying to figure out how to handle the fallout. Some resigned outright, others held emergency votes, but the damage was done, and no one wanted to be associated with her name. The residents began organizing a recall vote, but the mood in town wasn't just legal, it was personal. People had paid good money into a system that sold out their neighbor. That hits harder than a fine for a mailbox color violation. While the community rallied, I met with a lawyer friend of mine from my Air Force days, Margot, sharp as a switchblade and twice as dangerous in a courtroom. She looked over my paperwork and nodded. You've got them, Mercer. Not just for fraud. There's civil liability, misuse of funds, trespassing, water theft, and probably a few violations nobody's even heard of yet. She smiled the way a good lawyer does when they smell victory. You want to sue her personally? I paused for a second. It was tempting, no doubt, but deep down, I wasn't looking for her money or to drag her through court for years. I wanted restoration. I wanted my land back, and I wanted her gone from any position where she could do this to anyone else. So I told Margot, let's focus on getting the sale reversed. The rest will fall like dominoes. That evening, the community gathered again, this time in the town's Grange Hall. It was too big for a regular HOA meeting, but too small for what it had become. Everyone showed up, lawn-obsessed retirees, young couples who just moved in, kids who now understood the name Mercer meant something more than the guy who gives out butterscotch on Halloween. There were news crews outside waiting. Inside, the mood was tense, not angry, not chaotic, just heavy, like everyone had realized that trust, once broken, takes more than a freshly mulched flower bed to fix. I took the floor, not as a crusader, but as a neighbor. I told them the whole story, from the moment I saw the sign in my field to the second I discovered the forged documents. I didn't play hero, I just laid it out straight. Then I did something unexpected. I offered a solution. I told them I would work with the county to restore water access, not just legally, but responsibly. I'd spent decades managing that aquifer, and if they were willing to move forward without corruption, I'd help them redesign a sustainable system for free. No HOA fees, no middlemen, just community-supported infrastructure. You could hear the air change in the room when I said it. Hope, cautious but real, started to flicker in their eyes. Then, right on cue, Karenetta showed up. She entered like a faded queen, sunglasses on despite it being dusk, dressed in a blazer that screamed damage control. She walked straight to the front, ignored everyone's glares, and demanded to speak. The moderator hesitated, then gave her the mic. Her speech was exactly what I expected: deflection, half apologies, vague claims of miscommunication, and errors in procedure. She insisted that she acted in the community's best interest, but this time, no one clapped, no one nodded. People just stayed, arms crossed, jaws clenched. When she finally said, I still believe the HOA was within its legal right to reclaim and repurpose neglected land. I stood up and walked to the projector again. With one click, I displayed an email dated months before the land sale where she and her brother discussed flipping Mercer's land quietly before the old man kicks up a fuss. That was the moment she lost what little she had left. People began yelling, not at me, at her. Some demanded her arrest. One woman screamed that she'd voted for her every year and felt like a complete fool. Karenetta's face twisted, her voice cracked, and for the first time, she didn't have a comeback. She turned and left, cameras flashing behind her like lightning chasing a storm. The next day, the county announced they were launching a full investigation into her actions. Her accounts were frozen. The land sale was suspended pending a fraud review, and to everyone's relief, the recall vote passed unanimously. Karenetta was officially removed from her role as HOA president, barred from ever holding a board seat again. But the story wasn't over yet. The developer who'd bought my land was threatening legal action, claiming their purchase was in good faith. I wasn't worried. Margot was already drafting a motion to invalidate the contract based on the forged documents. But it was still a reminder that corruption leaves scars, and cleaning them takes time. And through it all, I kept doing what I always did, working the land, monitoring the water levels, making sure nothing exploded underground. But now I wasn't alone. Folks started stopping by, offering help, asking questions. For the first time in years, Oakwood Trails felt like an actual community, not just a neighborhood with matching shutters, but a place where people looked out for each other. One kid even handed me a drawing he made in class. It showed a cartoon, me holding a hose like a sword, standing on a green hill while a tiny woman in sunglasses ran away from a brown lawn. I taped it on my fridge. Sometimes you don't need to burn things down to fix them. You just need to turn off the tap long enough for people to notice what's been leaking. A month passed, and the dust that once hung heavy over Oakwood Trails began to settle, slowly, like an old wound finally deciding to scab over. The lawns were still dry in places, flower beds looked more like archaeological ruins than gardens, and some folks were still nursing bruised egos. But there was something in the air that hadn't been there before. Maybe it was humility. Maybe it was the smell of real community starting to return. For the first time in years, neighbors weren't just waving across driveways. They were talking, asking each other for help, sharing coffee on porches that once only saw silent nods. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. And that something was enough to make me believe the fight had been worth it. On a cool Saturday morning, I hosted what I called the Great Rewatering Barbecue. I set up grills on my land, the very land that was nearly paved over with townhouses and cul-de-sacs, and invited the whole neighborhood. People came, not out of obligation, but out of genuine curiosity and, I think, a bit of gratitude. There were lawn chairs lined up around the pond, kids playing tag where bulldozers had once been scheduled to break ground, and a table stacked with ribs, coleslaw, and pitchers of my infamous spiked lemonade. I hadn't seen the community smile like this in years. Before the burgers hit the grill, I stood up and said a few words, nothing rehearsed, just from the gut. I told them the land they were standing on wasn't just dirt and grass. It was memory, legacy. It was the place my grandfather taught me how to repair a fence and where my father used to say prayers before sunrise harvest. I reminded them that it wasn't HOA bylaws or fancy brochures that made a place worth living in. It was the people who respected the soil under their feet and the neighbors beside them. Then I turned and pointed to the new water system I had built. A simple, smart-controlled irrigation setup designed to deliver just what each part of the land needed, when it needed it. No waste, no middleman, and entirely independent of the HOA's now-defunct system. I said it was theirs to use, no charge, no forms, just community cooperation. A few folks teared up. One man clapped, then everyone joined in. It was a strange, beautiful sound, applause not for spectacle, but for something real. Later that afternoon, as the party began to wind down and the last batch of burgers sizzled on the grill, I found something waiting in my mailbox. It was an envelope, handwritten, no return address, but the handwriting was unmistakable, Karenetta Brimley. I opened it slowly, expecting some half-baked threat or a legal bluff. But inside was a letter, a real one. It wasn't quite an apology, but it came close in the way only prideful people know how to get near the line without crossing it. She said she was doing community service now, planting drought-resistant cacti at a nursery outside town. She said she had learned a lot about sustainability and that her HOA days were behind her. She ended with a single line that made me chuckle so loud I scared the neighbor's cat. I still think your aquifer system is over-engineered. I pinned the letter to the fridge, right next to the crayon drawing of me wielding a hose like a sword. Seemed fitting. As the sun began to set behind the hills, I sat on my porch with a cold drink in hand, watching the last few kids splash around in the creek. The wind carried the sound of laughter, hammers fixing fences, and music playing softly from a portable speaker. For a moment, it felt like all the wrongs had been set right. But then I remembered something I hadn't told anyone, a detail I had kept tucked away, not out of malice, but out of quiet satisfaction. The truth was, the land that Karenetta had sold wasn't the main farmland, not even close. Years ago, after a dispute over zoning lines with a previous HOA, I had quietly separated the parcels. What they thought was the Mercer tract was actually a decoy, an old, underused section registered under a legacy LLC I hadn't touched in decades. The real heart of Mercer land, the fields, the creek, the aquifer intake, had been secured under heritage protection laws I'd filed for long ago, laws that made it legally untouchable by any sale, lien, or HOA overreach. In other words, even if they hadn't been caught, the land would never have been theirs. I kept that detail close, not to boast, but because sometimes the best victories are the ones you don't have to explain. Karenetta had tried to take everything, and in the end, she lost more than she bargained for. Not just power, but trust, respect, and the illusion of control. And I had kept what mattered, my land, my dignity, and somehow, my sense of humor through the whole thing. As twilight turned the sky purple and orange, I looked out over the fields. They were still growing, not just the crops, but something deeper, a spirit, a stubborn resilience. And it wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to the folks who'd finally stood up, who'd asked questions, who'd remembered that neighborhoods are built with heart, not headlines. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Maybe there'd be another power-hungry Karenetta. Maybe someone would try to pave paradise again. But now I knew I wasn't alone, and that made all the difference. I took one last sip of my drink and turned off the porch light, letting the stars take over the job. The night was cool. The air smelled like fresh dirt and smoked ribs.